want to start? I guess a little background is a couple seasons ago on this show, I had Dale McGowan on, and we had this whole talk about the devil and music as, marginalized populations, how their cultures tend to be the ones that get demonized, and how that expresses itself in their artwork.
Okay.
And so in context of like America, we were talking about how that goes all the way back to Robert Johnson and the met the devil at the crossroads demonization of black music that way, which now still completely permeates rock and roll, right?
Yeah.
And after your presentation at the Satanic State, it got me thinking that there must be a lot of similarities in the Caribbean with the music that you're more kind of in tune with. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Okay. Yeah, I will I'll do my best. I actually gave it's funny when you asked me to do this interview, it actually coincided with another talk I gave just last week to another satanic organization that's here. They're the capital area Satanists, and we've worked with them before. Maybe we started to do stuff together about 2 summers ago, and basically, we are, in fellowship with one another. And although we don't, always do things together, every now and then one of us will reach out. And I wrote an article. Actually, I'm not sure if they even knew about the article, but since the Lil Nas song came out, I wrote, in that controversy, so-called controversy, I wrote an article that talked a little bit about sort of just my take on that. And then it just happened to be that they called and said, hey, would you like to talk a little bit more about this subject? We wanted to reach out to you guys. And so I gave a talk just last week on hell and kind of getting into some of the things that you're talking about. And they seemed to like it, and it went really well.
So how did that demonization of local culture express itself in Caribbean music and art?
So there's sort of a paradoxical relationship to West Indian people, generally speaking, and the devil, in the sense of the Christianization of the culture, and what was essentially the experience that that the Africans would go through, just as enslaved people. Christianity was sort of, right alongside of that process, especially as the islands became more and more established. It seems to be, when I do my research on the sort of escalation of plantation slavery, that there was a bit of it at first. Depending on the islands that you're talking about, there's different levels of Christianization. So, the Spanish and the Portuguese tended to have the Catholicism as the sort of driving factor of religion, and the British and or the Dutch, excuse me, Spanish, Portuguese, and French would be Catholic, and the British and the Dutch and everybody else would essentially be Protestant. And so, depending on the island, you're talking about 2 different types of evolution of Christianization. And with that, 2 different sort of, aspects of demonic sort of ideas in Africa, and demonizing African culture. Almost everywhere I look, just in terms of my lifetime of memory of studying these things, as well as just more recently, almost everywhere I look, African culture is demonized, and that's very heavily reflected in music and drumming specifically, and a lot of the practices like voodoo and obia and so forth that emanated in the islands after they got there, after the Africans got there. Their religious practices were demonized, particularly because they were seen as an inferior people, a sort of barbaric, primitive race, an inferior race, and therefore the religions that they practiced were looked upon as inferior. And the whole context of slavery is predicated on a particular combination of that idea as well as the religious political idea of conquer and dividing and conquer. And so those two things together, everywhere you see black people in the New World, their religion is demonized. But it kind of shapes out different ways depending on the Catholic or the Protestant sort of traditions. So there's that. With the Catholicism and what would become Santeria and all the other sort of iterations of Yoruba religion, there was a blending of religion. The Santeria, in fact, is a blending of that. And there were aspects of African culture that could survive that sort of demonization because it was sort of masked in the syncretic religion of a little bit of, the Orisha are correlating to such and such a saint. This is the Virgin Mary, this is the such and such. And so there's a sense of that combination of idols, essentially, and aspects of the divine that survived the experience. Whereas in Protestant cultures, it was a little bit more kind of, it was a little bit more strongly eradicated. And so, for example, on St. Croix, where I'm from, and the Danish West Indies, you had Lutherans, you had a lot of Moravians, you had Lutherans and Anglicans. And those traditions didn't really make a whole lot of room for that kind of syncretic aspect. Now, people still had that, but it was sort of practiced sort of in secret. There was a sort of a compartmentalization for that. But generally, the mission of the missionaries was to convert and to essentially do so by branding African religion as devil worship. So it just kind of shapes out different ways. We do have some traditions in the Danish West Indies. Jumbi is sort of one of the spirits. Is we talk about Jumbi as sort of, it's a part of the folklore. And I was actually just reading something today that was talking about Jumbi. And I remember growing up with Jumbi. Jumbi was very much an African sort of good and bad spirit. And it can kind of have a lot of different meanings. It's sort of a catch-all in some ways, but it's definitely something that's African derived. And it is certainly, still regarded as like the spirit, the spooky kind of spirit. And there are all kinds of Jumbis. There's all kind of folklore and, stuff that kind of has sort of been passed down from generations about Jumbi. And we do have Africanisms in the interview we did. I talked about, carnival, and I talked about the Mokojumbi, and I talked about obviously a lot of the sort of aspects of carnival culture that are very much African. So we do have a lot of Africanisms. But as far as demonization, it's a little bit different than, say, like in Haiti, or in Jamaica with Obi and stuff like that. Also, St. Croix is a smaller island, and although there's plenty of mountains and there's a lot of places for people to exist, it's a smaller island than places like Hispaniola and Jamaica. So in terms of maroon communities, you don't find as many as you do in some of the bigger islands where people could live very isolated sort of cultural lives, where they could preserve culture. But as far as, just to answer your question, the demonization is pretty much uniform in some sense, but it's a little bit more, I guess, intact in terms of its in terms of a defiance in practicing African religion anyway. Whereas, like in St. Croix, I didn't grow up a lot around a lot of actual African religious practice, like explicit African religious practice. People are either Christian or they're apathetic to religion, altogether, or they are, and I'm speaking really broadly, but or they are Rastafarian, right? You have those are sort of the three dominant, more or less, takes that you get if you just kind of just get a sense of what people are. A lot of people go to Anglican churches or Moravian churches, Lutheran churches. Those are the old churches there. And of course now, modern times you have people of all types of religion there. So, it's more than that now. But in terms of the sort of colonial and post-colonial sort of populations, you're generally talking about Christianity or later on Rastafarianism. There's not a lot of established sort of African religious practice there. There are remnants of African, folklore and so forth, but it's not like if you go to Haiti, you can find places where people are, having, not seances, but sessions and so forth, right, of, that stuff. We don't have that I know of in St. Croix, St. Thomas, or St. John, in our modern time.
Right, but it's kind of stuck around in stuff like African rhythms in the music and stuff like that.
Yes, yeah. And so in that sense, we don't consider it. It's not considered demonic because it's just enough for it to just be of a cultural importance. You know what I'm saying? It's not enough to draw contrast in the way that if people were actually practicing, voodoo, for example, or it's not enough to sort of actually rise to that level of like, okay, we need to call this demonic. But that's really specific to the landscape of the island. Jamaica is a different story. There's plenty of there's a lot more of, like I said, obia there. And there are some aspects of a syncretic kind of tradition there, but there's a little bit more of an actual sense of demonization. There was a lot of missionary work that went into the colonization of Jamaica, and like I said, Protestant missionaries. Later on, there would be all kinds of Christians there. There's Seventh-day Adventists and so forth, and those traditions are very, very specifically oriented towards demonizing African traditions, and there's not a whole lot of wiggle room there to sort of have a syncretic kind of tradition. It's either Christian or it's not, and if it's not, it's demonic. And so there may be people in Jamaica, for example, that practice, African religions or some sort of derivation of that, but they are sort of doing that in a way that's outside of the Christian mainstream, and therefore that's demonic. Sorry, it's a little long-winded.
No, that was really good. It's a half-hour show and we're 20 minutes in already. Yeah, I don't know where you'd like to take that from there. That's like,
well, I could go into some stuff that I talked about last week if that's okay, because one of the things last week that I mentioned was and just taking things to the mainland a little bit, where in the United States, like I was talking about in Jamaica, but definitely more so in the United States, there was a very strict line between African religious practice and Christianity, and a demonization of African religion. For example, it's long been said that we were in the United States, we were forbidden to have African drumming, and drumming is one of the aspects, a very sort of fundamental aspect of African ritual and religious practice. And the story is that the people in power recognize the power of the drums, not only in terms of the ritual aspect of it, but in terms of communication and in terms of rebellion. And having seen how African religion played a part in slave rebellions in Saint Domingue, in Jamaica, and in some cases, certainly on other islands, but most notably in what is now Haiti and Jamaica, having seen African religion essentially be a predicate for slave rebellion in the plantations and burning of crops and killing of masters and so forth. The people in power in the United States took note, and they recognized that link, and so they outlawed the drums very early on, because they realized that that was a part of the mentality of the Africans who were staging these rebellions and killing people and destroying the crops and all the financial sort of profit margins. And so so the way music evolved in the United States was without the drums. And so in some ways it's characteristically different than how religion and how people behaved in terms of the enslaved Africans in the other parts of the Caribbean and in South America. They didn't have drums. And so in addition to that, you had that demonization. So the drums are outlawed. The religion is condemned. The rituals are squelched. And it's very clear that African practices are demonic. Now, there were slaves that would, there are stories about, folks going into the woods and having secret sort of religious rituals, but it doesn't seem to be a very long sort of a long tradition of that. That seems to kind of convert into Christianity at some point. And so on some level, you start to see enslaved Africans practicing religion on their own, but it's Christianity. And so they're sneaking off to practice, but it's Christianity, and or it's just to have a good time. Christopher Cameron wrote in his book, he has some accounts of some of the behaviors of people in plantations in the 1800s who were doing things on Sunday and they weren't going to church. So there's some people who are practicing Christianity. There's some people who are not practicing Christianity at all. But it's very clear that they're not practicing African religions. They're not doing what folks were doing in Haiti or in other places in Jamaica. They're not singing songs to Shango and stuff like that. They don't have the drums. So there's a implicit bias, essentially, that African traditions and African identity is by its very nature demonic. And especially if it drives you to rebel against the slave masters, it's definitely demonic. And as Christianity grows, that tension is extended as more people are Christianized, and as the African Americans establish Christian churches like the AME Church and so forth. You start to see a sense of association with secular and the sacred being the secular is demonized and the sacred is not. And so as the blues, and I'm fast forwarding, but as the blues becomes more popular, you have that tension between that being secular music and therefore demonized versus the spirituals and all of the traditions that come from
pulling heavily from a lot of that gospel music too.
Exactly. And there's this is really old tension, and it's funny because last week I was talking about Thomas Dorsey. Thomas Dorsey is the father of modern gospel. Essentially, he's regarded as the father of modern gospel music. He's the author of, or the composer of, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, which is the song that was sort of Mahalia Jackson's signature song. It's the song that motivated Martin Luther King and inspired him and lifted him up in the civil rights era. And she would sing that song to him. And it became, an iconic song for her, as well as so many other gospel singers to come. And it's considered canon. Like today, Precious Lord, Take My Hand is canon. It is every bit as sacred as Wade in the Water, or as Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, or any other Negro spiritual. And yet Thomas Dorsey was a blues musician. He's in the Blues Hall of Fame. Like the American Blues Hall of Fame Thomas Dorsey is inducted into the Hall of Fame as a blues musician, and he comes from a tradition that is essentially demonized, but he was, riding that tension. And he played, blues in his earlier career, and at some point, he was doing blues and church on Sunday. And like I said, the song was popular, and he ended up kind of riding into his career, on the heels of gospel music and creating what we call like the canon of gospel music, modern gospel music. And he comes from an art form that's considered demonic. It was the musicians of juke joints and drinking and beer and and ill repute.
Mm-hmm.
And he is so there's always that tension. And then all of the rock and roll singers, I mean Little Richard and all these other people that come out of gospel music that would go on to become blues and rock and roll musicians, they're all blues and rock and roll musicians that were also church musicians. So there's a weird kind of tension there that that sometimes it's a blending of both worlds in terms of what's considered demonic music, and it's always been there in terms of the African American traditions. I'm pointing it out that it's subjective, I guess is what I want to say. Mm-hmm. Ultimately it's a subjective thing to call something demonic music, because we have these hardline examples of people who basically form the contours of gospel music, and they are demonic essentially, if you consider that to be demonic, but they give us the soundtrack for the sacred. So it's a bit of a paradox there. Also, a lot of gospel music is really, really influenced by Native American music of the Southeast Indians, and a lot of historians, musical historians, can draw real connections to the drum patterns and to a lot of the four quarter note sort of rhythms, and so forth, to what became gospel music. A lot of the vocal sort of melismas and things like that are essentially what you could hear in the Native American powwows and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that all of those things are in what is gospel music, and at the same time it's considered to be music that has elements of the demonic that has converted into the sacred.
Well, that was great.
I was just getting started. But no, it's really interesting. There's on that last point with the Native American roots of gospel music and rock and roll. If you're on PBS, I believe it's Independent Lens, there's a documentary that came out recently that talks about that. And if I find it, I have some footage of it. So I'll either send it to you or I'll find out what the link is, so you can share with your viewers. But I guess all that to say, black music has always been demonized before rock and roll. It's been politicized. It's been politicized for the furtherance of the sort of control and the dominance of black people in terms of their position in the class and social hierarchy, and in a way of control for maximizing economic profit for the colonial settlers who were here, whether we're talking about in the states or other places in the islands, but especially in the States. It's always been politicized and demonized, and so there's a lot to look into on that subject.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate. Where can people find you if they want to find out more?
Sure. So if you want to find me, I'm an artist, I'm a singer, I'm a songwriter, and also an activist. And And so my website is fibbymusic.net. That's FIBBYMUSIC.net. That's where you can find all my work and all the various links to my YouTube's shows and past records and so forth, and also what I'm doing now. As far as what we're doing with, or what I'm doing with the Black Non-Believers affiliate here in Washington, D.C., called Black Non-Believers of D.C., you can find us two places: on Facebook as facebook.com/BN of DC, just B and N and of DC, where we're regularly posting and engaging, a number of topics that relate to the Black non-believer experience. And in general, Black non-believers can be found on their official website, which is blacknonbelievers.org. And so you can find all of us there. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, and Clubhouse is Rogier1. That's ROGIERS1. And so just look me up there and send me a message and say hello. And yeah, you can find me all those places.
Great. Cool. That was fun.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.